could an ancient practitioner try to restore sight with a slender instrument, and what kind of sight might return? Picture a seated patient turning one clouded eye toward a steady lamp, while a practitioner keeps the instrument well back and an assistant waits beside the chair. Which eye seemed worth the attempt? This is a quiet history for sleep, and you can let details drift past whenever you like. The lamplight path will keep moving without you. How could three people make one brief moment still enough? I'm Elias. If you enjoy strange history told softly, subscribe for another quiet journey tomorrow night. The assistant has one observable task: support the seated head without turning the room into a struggle. The patient has another: attend to the lamp, first as a glow and perhaps later as a broader form. The practitioner must decide whether to continue or stop. If that lamp seemed brighter afterward, what it truly returned? What happened once the instrument was set down? And why could such an uncertain method remain in use across distant places until removal and an artificial lens changed the bargain? For now, the instrument remains only a slender line against the warm room. Cloth rests nearby. The opposite eye can be covered for comparison. The lamp does not flare or announce a miracle, it simply burns. Beyond this moment lie repeated observations, a period of waiting, an arranged chair, steady hands, bandaging, retesting, powerful spectacles, and a tiny optical replacement that belongs to a much later world. Each has a separate responsibility. The quiet puzzle is how those responsibilities came to be divided. The recurring patient, practitioner, assistant, caregiver, and later workers are representative roles assembled from documented tasks. They do not form one continuous life, and the story supplies none of their private moments. The first useful answer is simple enough to picture, though its consequences are not. In classic couching, the cloudy natural lens was usually moved away from the pupil and out of the visual axis. It was displaced rather than removed, and it generally remained inside the eye. The change might clear part of the path by which light entered, while normal focus did not return. That is the first bargain of the story. A glow might become available where the clouded lens had blocked it, yet brightness alone could not tell anyone what sort of vision had followed. We will save that larger answer for the moment when the lamp, a broad shape, and a pair of powerful spectacles can be compared properly. The ancient attempt was therefore neither an empty gesture nor a modern restoration. It aimed at a physical obstruction and sought an observable response. Its limit was built into the same change. The natural lens remained displaced, away from the place where its focusing power normally served the eye. Before the chair was arranged, the quieter work was deciding whether the clouded eye offered any response worth pursuing. A good repair begins by asking whether the fault is reachable. That is our first maintenance comparison, and it fits because the historical account begins with observation rather than action. In Celsus's translated account, the practitioner looked for visible qualities in the opacity, noticed whether it seemed fixed, and asked what the patient could still detect from light. Refusal stood beside acceptance as a possible result. The instrument could wait. The lamp had work to do first. That earlier examination changes the pressure of the opening scene. The practitioner is not arriving at the chair with an answer already decided. The patient has not been selected merely because the eye appears clouded. The lamp, the comparison eye, the changing look of the opacity, and time itself must all contribute before the room is prepared. The process also gives each object a future. The cloth that will later protect the resting eye first helps separate one eye from the other. The lamp that will later test a result first asks whether any response remains. The chair that will later support shared stillness is still unturned. Even the waiting instrument is defined by being unused. The scene shifts gently backward. Nothing has been attempted. The patient faces the same steady light, the other eye available for comparison, while the practitioner watches for the smallest useful distinction between no response and some remaining awareness. Which clouded eye in that old framework seemed worth considering at all? The lamp now belongs to observation rather than outcome. The practitioner compares the clouded eye with the other and attends to the response that remains. Salz's translated account did not treat every clouded appearance as equally promising. It described selected visible qualities, an opacity that seems still rather than shifting, and some continuing response to light that is narrower than the familiar picture of an ancient operator willing to try anything. The account contains a screen, and a screen can end with no attempt. Some appearances moved the case toward consideration. Others moved it away. Competence can be visible in a difficult job accepted, but it is often clearer in the difficult job declined. The patient takes part without needing an invented speech. One eye is compared with the other. The clouded eye attends to a steady source of light. A remaining response can be observed or reported without supplying exact words. Complete darkness and an awareness of brightness are not treated as the same condition, and that distinction changes what the practitioner does next. Age also entered this particular account. Celsus preferred people of an intermediate age rather than children or older adults. It was one observed condition among several, alongside the appearance of the opacity and the light response. This account had boundaries rather than one rule for every period and place. The preference makes the decision more selective, not more modern. It belongs beside the other signs within the ancient text's own reasoning. The practitioner weighs age, appearance, movement, and remaining response together. None becomes an isolated guarantee, and none allows the later outcome to be known in advance. Those observations sat inside an explanation of the eye that does not match modern anatomy. Old words translated as cataract carried ideas about something poured down or spread before sight. Pale or bright appearances could also receive names that do not settle into one neat modern diagnosis. The practitioner classified what could be seen and what response remained within a very different map of the eye. That vocabulary matters in a practical way. A familiar English word can make the ancient scene look deceptively familiar. Yet the practitioner at the lamp was not secretly applying a modern label. The signs belonged to visible appearance and response, and the theory around them described membranes, fluids, and inner spaces differently. Useful observation and mistaken explanation could therefore occupy the same room. The practitioner might be wrong about the inner arrangement and still notice that one opacity appeared fixed while another did not, or that one eye answered light while another seemed not to. The local skill lay in comparison, repeated looking, and a decision that could remain no. The patient stays at the center of that comparison through action. The head turns toward the lamp. The uncovered eye attends. The practitioner observes whether the visible condition and remaining response fit the narrow case described in the text. When they do not, the instrument never needs to become part of the scene. That refusal is the chapter's quiet reversal. Ancient practice is easily flattened into boldness because bold action leaves a stronger picture. A person deciding not to proceed is difficult to carve into a heroic monument and even harder to fit on a thumbnail. Yet the negative decision reveals a working boundary which is more interesting than courage without judgment. The comparison is repeated from more than one angle of attention. The practitioner can notice whether the opacity seems settled or shifting. The patient can indicate whether the lamp is present to the clouded eye when the other is covered. The light itself remains steady, making change in the response easier to notice than if the room altered around every look. No single observation completed the choice. Appearance could seem favorable while time still left the condition unsettled within the account's terms. A remaining light response could justify another look without promising an eventual result. The decision accumulated slowly. Compare, observe, decline, or wait, and only then reconsider. The light remains unchanged while time enters the story. Celsus advised waiting until the opacity seemed less fluid and more consolidated. The instruction belongs to that historical framework, but its narrative effect is immediate. Delay becomes an active part of selection, and the patient can return to the lamp for reassessment. At the later visit, the lamp is lit again. The patient returns, faces it, and completes the comparison that could not be finished at the first meeting. This return is the patient's first sustained choice in the story. Its local result is plain. The practitioner can compare the present appearance and remaining light response with what had been observed before. The account advised waiting until the cataract appeared no longer fluid and it coalesced toward hardness. Those terms came from an old explanatory system. Within that system, apparent consistency and maturity could alter whether an attempt seemed suitable. Time did not guarantee a favorable decision. It supplied another observation. The opacity might look more settled. The eye might still answer the lamp. The practitioner might decide that the signs now aligned closely enough to consider the next stage, or might again leave the instrument unused. What changes here is not certainty. It is the amount of observed information available for judgment. The second visit is not a replay because the interval has created a question the first meeting could not answer. Has the visible opacity altered within the old framework? Does the light response remain? Does the collected bundle of signs still point in the same direction? Reassessment turns time into evidence for a bounded decision. There is quiet discipline and decision allowed to remain no. Modern stories tend to reward action, preferably before the music has time to fade. Historical work is less obliging. Patience makes a poor heroic portrait, but it can prevent one uncertain sign from being mistaken for permission. The returning patient gives that patience a visible form. No motive or private feeling is required. Attendance itself is the choice. Come back, face the same light. Allow the clouded and comparison eyes to be observed again. The return turns a single meeting into a sequence, and a sequence can reveal change. The household role remains equally practical. Someone makes continued observation possible and will later make quiet care possible, but no kinship or home scene has to be invented. For now, the handoff is simply from waiting outside the treatment room to arriving at its lamp again. The practitioner also has an observable choice. The interval can end in another refusal. A case is not pushed toward action merely because time has passed. Only when the visible condition, residual response, age preference, and apparent maturity align within the account does the possibility move forward. The selection loop can now close. In this Celsian account, the case was narrowed through a bundle of signs, visible appearance, and opacity that seemed immobile, some residual response to light, a preference for intermediate age, and apparent maturity over time. No one sign promised success. Together they describe the sort of case the practitioner might consider. That bundle changes the picture of expertise. The operation did not begin with the slender instrument. It began with looking, comparing, delaying, and refusing. The inaccurate larger theory did not become modern medicine merely because some observations were practical, nor did its errors erase every act of attention recorded in the text. The second visit produces a changed state. The patient has returned. The comparison has been repeated. The practitioner has either stopped the process or allowed it to move toward preparation. For the path we are following, the bounded decision is to continue, and responsibility passes away from the calendar. The lamp has also changed jobs again. It began as a clue in the opening, became a screening cue, and now closes the period of waiting. Its glow remains physically the same. What changes is the question being asked of it, a pattern that will carry through the rest of the story. A chair is turned. A useful light is chosen. Space opens behind the seated patient for an assistant whose task will be stability rather than spectacle. Cloth and lamp take their places before the instrument matters. Time has done all it can and the room must now do its share. The chair turns toward the light. That small movement changes the room from a place of reassessment into a place arranged for one difficult task. The patient is seated, the assistant takes position to support the head, and the practitioner needs a clear view. Celsus's translated description places posture and assistance before the decisive use of the instrument. The arrangement is plain. It is also consequential. A steady source of illumination makes the visible field available. The chair establishes general posture. The assistant accepts the work of stability, leaving the practitioner free to observe and make a bounded judgment. The slender instrument remains held back, the last object to become relevant rather than the first. The chair deserves a moment because it carries part of the control. Historical pictures naturally favor the hand holding the unusual tool. Furniture has less talent for self-promotion. Yet without the turn seat, useful light, and a stable position, the tool would be asked to solve problems that belong to the room. The direction of light matters before anything else can be judged. A shadowed field would conceal the visible signs on which the practitioner depends. A seated position gives the assistant and patient a shared reference. Neither change guarantees a result, but both remove uncertainty that the instrument itself cannot correct. The assistant's task is described without struggle. Supporting the seated head is not a contest between bodies. It is one limited condition held steady for another worker. The patient remains a participant, already having returned for reassessment and now taking the chosen place before the lamp. The practitioner checks the arrangement rather than performing drama. Light must fall where observation is possible. The covered and uncovered eyes must remain available for the later comparison. The selected side will matter to how control is divided, but that detail belongs to the next handoff, after the room itself is complete. Objects now carry progress. The chair has moved. The lamp has found its place. The cloth is ready. The assistant stands where support can be given. Nothing has happened inside the eye, yet the conditions surrounding the attempt are no longer loose. The room also narrows the number of decisions that must be made at once. Posture is settled. Illumination is settled. Preparation has converted several open questions into fixed conditions. Control begins outside the hand. Fixed lighting and posture now carry their part of control, allowing the practitioner to concentrate on observation. The lamp begins a quiet double duty. Before the attempt, it makes the chosen eye and the practitioner's view more available. Afterward, once the instrument has left the scene, the same steady light can receive the patient's attention again. One ordinary object joins preparation to the first outcome without pretending to measure everything sight can do. The room is ready, but the comparison is not. Cloth must cover the other eye. The chosen side changes which hand the historical description assigns to controlled work. Most importantly, the patient must join the assistant in a shared stillness that cannot be supplied by furniture alone. The wide view narrows only as far as the chair, never toward operative detail. The comparison eye and chosen side come next. Cloth settles over the comparison eye. The action is simple, visible, and new. It allows attention to rest on the clouded eye alone, while the lamp stays in the position established by the room. In the bounded historical descriptions behind this scene, sight also affected which hand the worker used. Comparison and handedness were considered before the central change. The patient remains seated and participates in the shared stillness. No courage, fear, hope, or suffering has to be supplied. Stable support lets the practitioner keep watching, and the comparison that began in Chapter 02 can continue under controlled conditions. With the comparison eye covered and the chosen side known, comparison and hand use are settled before tool form is considered. The assistant's work is narrow enough to seem unremarkable, which is often the fate of dependable work. A portrait can celebrate the practitioner and perhaps remember the instrument. It rarely gives the supporting pair of hands equal billing. The scene itself is less forgetful. If stability changes, the practitioner's conditions change with it. The chosen side adds another sign of forethought without becoming an instruction. The source tradition describes different hand use according to the side being treated. That detail shows that control was divided before action. We need no sequence beyond it. The historical value lies in the fact that laterality mattered to planning. The patient's stillness keeps the lamp useful, and the comparison eye covered without requiring a speech or an assigned emotion. The shared stillness also creates the first true convergence in the story. Selection belonged to earlier visits. Light and posture belonged to the room. Comparison and side now belong to the chair. The separate preparations meet here, but the conceptual displacement has not yet occurred. The patient is not a passive surface within this arrangement. Returning for reassessment was one choice. Taking part in the shared stillness is another. That participation completes the preparation. Light, posture, comparison, side, and support now belong to one coordinated moment. The assistant's handoff will travel farther than the chair. Once the central moment is passed, physical support will end. Stability will then become a different task carried by cloth, rest, protection, and a later retest. The caregiver is not entered yet, but that later responsibility is already visible. The practitioner turns attention from people to the object held at a distance. Human steadiness can organize a room, but it cannot decide what kind of instrument the text considered controllable. The next limit lies in form. A point described as capable but not excessively fine, a shaft or grip that may restrain motion, and a memorable title that must not be mistaken for material proof. The chair remains still at the edge of the lamplight. We move to a nearby table where the unusual object can lose its immediate tension and become a historical question. What can a text, a form, and a name tell us about intended control, without pretending that any surviving needle belonged to this room? On the table, the instrument becomes a shape rather than an event. Celsus described a point capable of the task but not excessively fine. The wording values a balance, enough capability to act, enough substance to remain controlled. It tells us what one writer thought the object should permit and what too delicate a form might fail to restrain. The phrase is qualitative, which is exactly what the story needs. It gives no measurement and no pattern for imitation. It preserves a design judgment. The point should serve a controlled purpose without becoming so fine that the writer considered it unsuitable. Other descriptions and later images offer a second example: wider shafts, wrapped grips, or stop-like forms that can suggest steadiness and limited notion. The forms vary and their context vary with them. They are useful as evidence of design concerns, not as one universal model waiting to be copied. A wider shaft changes how the object presents itself to a hand. A wrap or grip makes purchase visible. A stop-like form suggests that restraint can be built into an object rather than left entirely to attention. These are clues to intended control, not proof of one exact instrument or act. The third example arrives through a title. One Chinese tradition can be rendered as the golden needle method, while the detailed procedure text does not securely establish gold as the material of every inserted needle. The name is traveled with admirable ease. Gold itself is heavier, historically and otherwise. Together, the examples reveal a safety logic at the level the evidence can bear. The point should remain manageable. The grip or shaft makes control visible in form. The bright title preserves a tradition while warning us not to turn a name into a metal analysis. A text can state a desired quality. A contextual object can show that a form existed. A later image can show how a later artist imagined the scene. None securely identifies the exact instrument in our lamplit room, and no dimensions or path are needed. Read together. The written quality, contextual object, and later picture answer different questions. They do not merge into a single recovered instrument or scene. No surviving object is assigned to this representative room. The practitioner's observable choice is therefore bounded by quality rather than flourish. The object should serve control. Its most interesting feature may be the motion it was meant to limit, because in such a delicate task, excess movement would defeat the purpose. The table changes the rhythm of the chapter. No bodies are in contact. The chair waits beyond the frame. A line of translated text sits beside a wider shaft and a wrapped grip. Evidence that seemed dramatic at first becomes quiet craftsmanship, considered through restraint. These three show that the tool carried an intended boundary and that the boundary mattered to what came next. The object can now leave the table. Room, light, posture, comparison, side-dependent control. shared stillness, and the qualitative tool limit are all in place. None has yet delivered the central conceptual change, and none can be repeated once that change occurs. We return to the lamp and waiting chair. The assistant keeps the head steady. The patient holds to the shared stillness. The practitioner carries the bounded decision. The instrument appears only as a slender symbol, and the story remains far enough away to explain what changed without showing how to reproduce it. The room is quiet in a different way now. Preparation has ended. The comparison eye remains covered, the assistant's support is steady, and the patient continues the seated task. What follows is described only as an optical change without contact, coordinates, measurements, force, or a sequence of movements. Classic couching aimed to displace the cloudy natural lens below the pupil and out of the visual axis. The lens was usually left inside the eye rather than extracted. The obstruction, therefore, moved away from the path before the pupil, while the natural lens no longer served focus in its usual position. That is the complete conceptual displacement. It needs to be said once clearly, because every earlier chapter prepared for it, and every later chapter depends on its result. The cloudy lens has not vanished. It has not become clear. It has changed position relative to the pupil. The change creates an immediate before and after. Before, the opacity occupied the path through which light needed to pass. After, it was intended to lie away from that path, still present within the eye. The physical object remained. Its relationship to the pupil changed. The patient's stillness now serves its purpose. It allowed the shared arrangement to remain intact through the one bounded change the story can name. The assistant's stability task also reaches completion. Support was held long enough for the practitioner to produce something that could be tested, and responsibility can begin moving away from the chair. The practitioner's local result is not a proclamation. It is a new condition placed before the lamp. Selection asks whether an eye still answered light. Preparation created a controlled setting. Displacement changed the obstruction. Only the patient can now complete the next observable choice by attending once more to the steady glow. The assistant releases support. The practitioner sets the slender object beyond the storybook frame. The patient's attention shifts from maintaining stillness to finding the lamp. The room itself relaxes as those actions occur. The most unusual object leaves first. The cloth over the comparison eye remains. The lamp continues without a flare. The patient and observers now face a question that is quieter than the attempt and more useful than a declaration. Has the response to light changed? The title's first mechanism loop is closed. The prepared condition has become a displaced, retained lens awaiting the lamp. What remains uncertain is more interesting than another explanation of the act. If the path before the pupil has changed, will the lamp seem different? A response could show that something observable followed the displacement. It cannot yet tell us the larger meaning of seeing again. The instrument does not return. That absence is progress. The highest pressure object in the story has completed its explanatory work and can rest. The room contains only the lamp, a few broad forms, the patient, and two observers waiting for the smallest supported result. The lamp stays exactly where it was. The patient attends to its glow after the obstruction has been displaced. The patient, rather than the practitioner, supplies the response by attending again to the same light. A response can be shown or reported, and the team can observe that the state of the room is no longer the same. A stronger awareness of brightness could be consistent with a clearer visual axis. In some outcome, a broad form might also become available. The old testing tradition sought an immediate observable change, and the lamp offered one. It marked a before and an after without claiming to measure everything vision could become. Only one new fact is added here. The lamp response can indicate that the changed visual axis admitted a different response to light. The full questions of accommodation, correction, comfort, field, and durable usefulness remain unopened until Chapter 10. This room supplies the response, not the complete optical verdict. The patient attends once, then again, while the comparison remains broad. Is the glow newly available? Can a large shape be distinguished from the darker room? These are outcome cues, small enough for the setting and clear enough to produce an observable result. The patient's attention gives the practitioner something limited to record rather than a miracle to announce. The assistant sees the stability handoff complete. Their earlier work has reached its first external cue. The lamp is detected differently, or a broad form becomes newly available within the evidence boundary. There is restrained human change in that result without an invented expression. At the beginning, the patient faced the lamp to show what remained before an attempt. Now the same action tests what has changed after it. Repetition becomes progress because the condition between the two tests is different. Much later, modern outcome studies confirm why such a response must remain modest. Their findings belong to particular designs, places, correction status, and follow-up, and cannot be turned into an ancient rate. That single boundary is enough. The ancient lamp test and a modern examination ask different sizes of question. The lamp adds a change, not a conclusion. Something in the path for light may have become more available. Whether the result persists is now the nearest question. The practitioner cannot answer it in one sitting because duration belongs to cloth, rest, protection, and a later return to light. Responsibility leaves the assistant's hands and travels into the household. The instrument is absent. A bandage replaces it as the central object. The caregiver receives the task of supporting quiet care and making a later retest possible. Stability has changed form. The room dims slightly without making the lamp disappear. The patient's first post-attempt attention has shown a changed response. The next choice is slower. Remain with the documented aftercare, then attend to the lamp again and learn whether the response has held. Folded cloth now occupies the place where the instrument once drew attention. Celsus' account describes bandaging, rest, restricted food, and soothing applications after the operation. It also recognizes that the displaced opacity could return. These details make the procedure extend beyond the chair and into a period of tending. The caregiver accepts the next stability handoff. It is no longer the assistant's task of supporting the seated head. It is protection around the resting patient, attention to the documented care, and preservation of the conditions in which a later change can be noticed. The responsibility has moved from a brief shared stillness to a quieter stretch of time. The bandage remains in place, rest is supported, and a later comparison with the lamp becomes possible. No relationship, reassurance, meal, or private worry has to be supplied. The tasks show one person carrying the result after the practitioner has left the center of the scene. The historical list of care also reveals a change in pace. Selection unfolded across visits. The attempt occupied a brief coordinated interval. Aftercare expands again into hours and days of protection and observation, though the narration assigns no exact schedule. The operation has become a process with more than one timescale. The patient continues to participate. Rest is one observable task. Returning attention to the lamp later is another. The first post-attempt response becomes meaningful only if it can be compared with the response after the immediate room has passed. Celsus' recognition that the displaced cataract could rise again gives the retest its consequence. The cloudy lens had been moved rather than removed. If the obstruction returned toward the visual axis, the newly available brightness could diminish. The first visible change was capable of being undone. We leave the text further procedural response undescribed. Recurrence is the relevant historical fact. It shows why duration belonged to the outcome and why care could not be treated as scenery placed after the real event. The caregiver protects the interval, the patient attends again. The lamp supplies the comparison. If the glow remains available, the handoff has produced a local result that can be observed. If it does not, the difference is also visible. The story does not choose a universal ending for every patient. It follows the chain that made a later answer possible. The retest may be as quiet as the first examination. The comparison eye can again be separated. The clouded eye can again attend to steady light. What differs is the history between the two observations. The obstruction was displaced, the first response was noted, and time has now tested whether that altered state persisted. This is the second maintenance comparison in the draft. Anyone who has watched a repair through weather or ordinary use knows that the follow-up check can tell a different story from the moment the tool was put away. Here the comparison is bounded to durability, protect the result, return to it, and learn whether the change holds. The assistant's work and caregiver's work echo without becoming the same task. One stabilized the moment of displacement. The other stabilized the period in which the result could persist or change. Their handoff gives continuity to a story that might otherwise remember only the practitioner. The aftercare loop closes with the later lamp retest. The operation was not one instant followed by an assumed conclusion. It was selection, preparation, a bounded physical change, an immediate response, tending, and another look. The most dramatic object had disappeared, but the work had not. If the glow remained, a deeper question became unavoidable. Durability could preserve whatever response had been gained, but it could not supply the natural focusing power missing from the visual axis. The bandage could protect an interval. It could not make the outline of the lamp sharp. The cloth folds aside. A broad form is placed near the steady light. Far later, a strong spectacle lens catches the same amber reflection. At last the story can compare three practical states without borrowing one person's private vision, detecting the lamp, recognizing a broad form, and using external correction to seek detail. The lamp is detected first. That is the smallest practical state, and the one the ancient test could most directly seek. A person may attend to brightness and show that the changed visual axis admits a response. The result matters because it differs from no response, yet it says almost nothing about the clarity of the flame, the shape of its holder, or objects farther into the room. Detection can guide action in a limited way. A brighter area may be distinguished from a darker one. The direction of a steady glow may become available. These are practical differences without being normal focused vision, and the chapter keeps them at that modest scale. The second state is a broad form. The patient might distinguish a large shape from its surroundings, perhaps the lamp body against a darker wall or a person crossing the lit part of the room. This is more than brightness alone. It is still far from the stable detail that ordinary reading, close work, or recognition at distance would require. Broad form also depends on conditions. Contrast, size, distance, and available light may change what can be distinguished. The story does not turn those conditions into a universal visual simulation. It uses them to show why the phrase "sight returned" can hide several very different levels of function. The difference comes from the job of the natural lens. Classic couching usually left that lens inside the eye, but displaced from the visual axis, so its optics were functionally aphakic or aphakia-like. Physical aphakia means the lens is actually absent, as after removal without replacement. One state retains a displaced lens and the other does not, but both can leave normal focusing power missing where it is needed. Without normal lens power in the visual axis, the eye undergoes a major refractive change. Natural accommodation is also lost. The eye cannot adjust focus between distances in the ordinary way. A lamp can be bright, and a large shape distinguishable while fine detail remains badly blurred. Accommodation matters because ordinary vision is not one fixed distance photograph. Attention moves from a nearby hand to a lamp across the room, from a broad doorway to a smaller object, from one working distance to another. Without the natural lens doing its usual work, that change of focus no longer occurs normally. Now the third state arrives through a much later optical worker and a strong plus spectacle lens. External correction can bring some detail into better focus. It does not restore the natural lens or its accommodation. It places powerful optical help in front of the eye, changing what a later lens user may resolve under corrected conditions. The spectacle worker's task is concrete and separate from the ancient patient's life. A strong lens is placed before a broad visual target. The target is compared with and without that correction. The observable result is a potential improvement in focus, while the correction's own effects remain present. The first trade-off is magnification. Objects may appear larger through powerful aphakic spectacles. That can accompany improved detail, but it also changes the apparent scale of the scene. The corrected world is not simply the same world made sharper. The second trade-off is distortion. Edges and movement can behave differently away from the central portion of the lens. A person turning the head or shifting gaze may encounter changes that ordinary lower-powered correction does not produce to the same degree. The third is field. The usable view can narrow, so a sharper object may be available through a more restricted window. Correction, therefore, adds potential and a new set of practical adjustments at the same time. The three states now sit beside one another without being blended. In the first, the lamp is detected. In the second, a broad form is recognized. In the third, powerful external correction may improve detail while adding magnification, distortion, and field trade-offs. None describes one universal person's experience, but together they answer what seeing again could contain. The answer is not simply yes or no. A change in brightness could matter to someone whose early response was very limited. Broad form perception could add another practical distinction. Strong correction could reveal further potential in some eyes. Comfort, damage, recurrence, and circumstances of use could still change whether any of that became durable, useful sight. The main opening loop can finally close. When the ancient lamp seemed brighter, what returned was a bounded response to light, possibly joined by broad form, not the normal focusing surface of the natural lens. Couching changed the obstruction. It did not restore accommodation, and it did not erase the difference between uncorrected response and corrected potential. That distinction explains why the operation could matter without becoming a cure. It also explains why modern outcome studies can report very poor results and serious complications while still finding some corrected potential in particular eyes. Presenting vision, corrected vision, comfort, damage, and durability answer different questions. Returning for reassessment allowed selection. Shared stillness allowed the coordinated attempt. Attention to the lab supplied an immediate result, and retesting supplied a durability check. The narration invents no feeling. It shows how each action produced a different answer. The later spectacle worker receives the optical problem rather than the patient's biography. Once focus is named as a missing responsibility, it can be addressed separately from the obstruction. External lenses offered one answer, useful and imperfect. Removing the cloudy lens would offer a different anatomical answer while leaving focus to correction. The room opens into an atlas, but the lamp stays at its center. We can ask why a limited method endured without pretending that every community shared one motive or received the practice by one road. The answer begins with choices constrained by what was locally available, trusted, affordable, known, and possible. Separate pages gather around the lamp. One contains Greek and Latin descriptions. Another contains the layered Sanskrit tradition associated with Sushmor. A third holds Chinese and Arabic evidence in their own periods. The shared object is an optical problem. The pages do not have to become one unbroken root. The first contrast concerns practical features. The Celsian account records selection, weighting, posture, assistance, tool qualities, displacement, immediate testing, and aftercare. Sanskrit traditions preserve overlapping concerns with maturity, instruments, posture, and testing, but similarity alone cannot tell us which way knowledge moved or when each layer took shape. What the contrast does show is that practical questions could recur. Which case appeared suitable? How was the seated task stabilized? What quantity should the instrument have? How would change be tested? Similar questions can appear across traditions without proving a single inventor or a straight road of transmission. No certain single birthplace or inventor is established, and one acquired Sumer project analysis rejects the familiar fixed 600 BCE date for the surviving Sunritasashita Hitar, describing a layered textual history instead. A dated manuscript witness anchors that copied object, not the original composition of every passage it carries. The boundary changes the historical picture from a birth certificate into a long set of working pages. Layers can preserve old material, later revision, and different moments of copying or commentary. That uncertainty is not empty. It tells us why one date cannot carry the full history of a practice that appears in several bodies of evidence. The second contrast comes from Chinese and Arabic material. A Chinese golden needle title and descriptions of moving the lens away from the pupil preserve one named tradition. Arabic ophthalmic manuals show specialist attention to diseases of the eye, while a hollow tube aspiration story remains tied to its named account rather than becoming a routine method across a vast region. The specialist role matters because endurance belongs to people and institutions as well as tools. Manuals organize knowledge. Practitioners acquire reputations. Households hear accounts of outcomes. The method can persist through local trust and available expertise even as its language and surrounding theory differ. These clusters change the viewer's understanding by showing variation within persistence. The broad idea of altering an obstruction could remain recognizable while names, theories, instruments, institutional roles, and additional practices change. Endurance did not require every page to be identical. It also did not require one universal motive. In a place with severely constrained choices, a possibility of changed light might remain worth considering, even when results were uncertain and risks substantial. That is a human explanation of the bargain, not a claim that every patient or household reasoned alike. The third contrast belongs to bounded modern evidence from African settings. The Nigerian population and clinic studies document poor outcomes, complications, and in some eyes a difference between presenting vision and corrected potential. Separate research on service use points to combinations of access, trust, cost, family support, knowledge, perceived risk, and confidence in available care. Those combinations can shift from one place to another. Distance may matter where services are far away. Cost may matter differently when transport and household support are included. Trust can follow prior testimony, local reputation, or uncertainty about institutional care. None of these pressures needs to explain every decision in order to matter in a named setting. The modern combinations do not reveal private ancient motives. They show why a single word, such as ignorance, cannot explain an enduring practical choice. People act among options that differ in distance, cost, reputation, support, and perceived consequence. When alternatives are difficult to reach or uncertain to trust, an imperfect local method may persist without becoming irrational or uniform. The atlas offers endurance rather than a source inventory. In one setting, the text records a careful screen and risky displacement. In another, a title, manual, or specialist row carries the work differently. In modern named settings, constrained service choices show how practical pressures coexist. None supplies a universal root or reason. What persisted was the optical bargain itself. A cloudy obstruction might be moved, light might change, focus would remain deeply altered, and the result might not last. As long as that bargain remained one of the available possibilities, people and practitioners could continue to consider it within their circumstances. The endurance question now has a causal answer. A limited method can remain when it offers a possible local change and when safer, more reliable, or more trusted alternatives are not equally available. That answer respects practical choice while keeping the severe limits of the method visible. It also reveals what a genuinely different solution had to change. Refining the same displacement could not turn a retained cloudy lens into a normal focusing element. The next technical break had to alter the anatomy of the obstruction by removing the lens rather than leaving it elsewhere inside the eye. Removal exposed the focusing problem more plainly. Once the cloudy natural lens was extracted, it was physically absent. The path for light had been cleared differently, but optical power still had to come from somewhere. The history narrows from many pages to two later handoffs: planned extraction and intraocular replacement. The atlas folds. An 18th century sheet of paper lies beside instruments at rest. Beyond it, a 20th century artificial lens catches a small reflection from the same lamp. Neither object is a complete answer by itself. One changes what is removed. The other changes what can be replaced. The 18th century paper carries a precise but bounded distinction. One acquired Reassessment associates Jacques Daviel with the first contemporaneously documented planned primary cataract extraction on 18 September 1750 within its evidence set. An episode linked to 1747 involved fragment removal after an attempted couching, which is not the same planned primary procedure. That is the Daviel boundary in full. It does not claim an absolute global first, and it places Daviel within a wider extraction history. The technical change matters more than a solitary portrait. Planned extraction aimed to remove the cloudy natural lens instead of displacing it and usually leaving it inside the eye. Extraction changed the obstruction decisively. The cloudy lens no longer remained displaced within the eye. Yet removal produced physical aphakia unless optical power was supplied afterward. The anatomical problem and the focusing problem had become visibly separate responsibilities. The distinction also changes the meaning of recurrence. A displaced cloudy lens could move back toward the visual axis. A removed lens could not return in that same way because the obstruction had been taken out. Extraction altered the physical bargain rather than simply repeating displacement with a different instrument. Powerful spectacles could address focus from outside with the trade-offs already seen. The larger transformation came when optical workers and surgical teams developed an artificial lens that could remain inside the eye after the natural lens had been removed. Intraocular replacement addressed missing power nearer the location where that power was needed. The returning lamp makes the difference plain. Couching could make the glow more available by moving an obstruction. Extraction could clear that obstruction by taking the lens out. An intraocular lens was designed to restore optical power after removal, addressing focus rather than merely increasing brightness. The artificial lens therefore belongs to a different responsibility from the ancient slender instrument. One sought to move cloudy natural material away from the visual axis. The other sought to provide optical power after natural material had been removed. Their visual similarity as small objects should not hide their different jobs. Harold Ridley belongs within this later history, but collaborative context belongs with him. Predecessors, patients, surgical colleagues, designers, manufacturers, complications, contested reception, and later revision all shaped the development of intraocular lenses. Credit can be specific without turning one person into the entire system. The changed belief of the episode settles into place. Ancient couching and modern lens replacement did not perform better and worse versions of one identical job. Couching tried to clear a path for light while leaving the natural lens displaced. Extraction removed the obstruction and left optical power absent. Intraocular replacement addressed that missing power. Progress arrived through a chain of separations. Observation was separated from assumption. Selection was separated from action. Stability was divided among room, patient, assistant, and caregiver. Immediate brightness was separated from durability. Broad form was separated from corrected detail. Removal was separated from replacement. The people in that chain mattered because each carried a bounded responsibility. The patient returned, participated, attended, and retested. The assistant held one moment steady. The caregiver protected the interval. The practitioner selected and judged. Later optical workers, patients, designers, and surgical collaborators carried the focusing problem into a different technical world. No heroic catalogue is needed at the end. The changed objects tell the sequence more quietly. The slender instrument is gone from the room. The cloth is folded. Strong spectacles hold an amber reflection. The extraction paper and artificial lens remain in their periods, connected by the optical responsibility that passed between them. This is the third and final maintenance comparison reduced to its useful lesson. Clearing an obstruction is not the same as restoring the function that obstruction concealed. A repair becomes more intelligible when those jobs are named separately, because one successful change may reveal the next missing responsibility. The lamp returns without becoming brighter. Early in the journey, its glow was a possible response behind a clouded path. After displacement, it could become a stronger but unfocused presence. Beside a broad form, it asked what shape could be recognized. Through later correction and replacement, its outline became the symbol of focus. Nothing in the flame has changed. Its meaning has. The first room can remain warm and still, with the patient no longer asked to perform another task and the assistant's hands at rest. The lantern workers recede into their separate times. The long bargain with light has reached its answer. You may let the outline soften again and drift wherever the quiet takes you.